So I've asked, this is inevitably the most difficult spot in any conference schedule, is the after dinner. Danny didn't draw this space by reason of some sort of a lottery where he got the short stick or anything of that nature, but I wanted to, as we began with a frame with Ray Aldred directing our attention to a theology of land that talked about identity and covenant and treaty and new beginnings and the sacraments that connect us to one another and the land that treaty is in part representative of. And he framed us up a biblical and theological piece. I wanted us to conclude with a similar piece. And so Danny Zacharias, whom I've come to know and deeply love and appreciate as a nephew, together with his lovely wife Maria and their kids over the years. He's an incredibly gracious young man and scholar. He's Cree from Manitoba. It's about the only non-redeeming quality I could name. He's a biblical scholar, teaches New Testament at Acadia Divinity College in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And Greek, he's written extensively, including an introductory Greek text, which I probably would have liked to have had when I did my first Greek course. He's a NAIITS faculty member who's as dedicated to us as any faculty member we have. And as you know from the introduction yesterday evening, together with Kimberly Madison Horn-Jackson, is one of two of our new editorial team taking up the journal editing task from our beloved sister Wendy Peterson. What I have particularly appreciated about Danny over these last years is his increased desire to drive into what it means for him to be a Cree man, a biblical scholar who is a Cree man, an articulate and increasingly articulate theologian who is a Cree scholar, a husband who is transferring what it means to be Cree to his wife and family in increasingly loving and caring ways and supportive ways, but who walks among us with a deep humility and a wonderful and gracious sense of humor. Danny, come on along.
So I'm talking about GraceLand. And so I'm going to start by talking about the concept of grace, why I use that word when talking about land and relationship between the Creator and humanity and non-human creation. So I'm going to first focus on the concept of grace and what I mean by that. What do I mean to say that our relationship with land is grace-framed? Why is that good language when we talk about our relationship to where we are? So there was a steady rise of anti-Semitism through the history of the church, and that really began within the New Testament in some way. The church saw that the opposition to Jesus by the Pharisees and Jesus' own critique of those Pharisees began to be applied to all Jews. And so it became a condemnation of Judaism. And part of that condemnation, and I'm summarizing this a bit unfairly, but part of this anti-Semitism started a juxtaposition then between law and grace. People represented this law and grace binary. Jesus was grace, but the Pharisees were law. The Apostle Paul was grace, but his Jewish opponents were law. Christianity was grace. Judaism was law. And it was inevitable that in some sense the Old Testament then was seen as the place that we find law, but then the New Testament is the place that we find grace. So the Old Testament was seen as literature of a legalistic religion. But this underwent a profound shift in 1977 by a scholar named E.P. Sanders. He published a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And he permanently altered our conception of the nature of Jewish faith and practice in the Second Temple period. He tore down that characterization of Judaism as being legalistic. And he did that by undergoing a comprehensive look at Second Temple Jewish literature, and he showed that the pattern of grace that we see in the New Testament is the same as that we see in the Old. It didn't advocate for earning your salvation. God always initiates a relationship with his creation first as an act of grace. Grace was not a word also coined by the Apostle Paul to talk about Jesus. Nor was the word confined to the New Testament, and that's surprising to hear for some Christians. The word grace was actually common language within the Greco-Roman culture, functioning especially within the context of the patron-client system of relations. Patrons were individuals, usually within the upper class or with significant wealth, and patrons would have clients. And this relationship between the patron and the client entailed responsibility one to another. Clients would spend part of each day serving the patron in some manner, and at the end of each day, the client would receive a small gift from the patron. In addition to this small gift, the patron also bore the responsibility of assisting their clients should more significant issues arise, like legal issues. Patronage was an essential means of acquiring access to goods, protection, or opportunities for employment and advancement. The giving and receiving of favors was, according to a first-century participant, the practice that constitutes the chief bond of human society. The reason this social and cultural practice becomes so significant for the New Testament is that the very language used for patron and client is what is utilized to talk about Christ and the believer. The gift and the protection by the superior patron was called grace. What's more, the act of service provided from the client to the patron was also called grace. This relationship, once initiated, began a continual cycle of reciprocity. Adding recently to this discussion is a work by John Barclay. Barclay, in 2015, his book called Paul and the Gift, he discusses the language of grace and gift, showing how the Western tradition, especially beginning with Immanuel Kant, assumed that a gift was always something given without expectation of reciprocity, and that gifts should be given without any hope of reciprocity. But this was not the case in the ancient world. The giving of a gift and resulting reciprocity was the norm, for one was obligated to respond appropriately to a gift. In Barclay's second chapter, he provides a taxonomy of gift in the ancient world, providing 6 characteristics. Superabundance, meaning the extravagance and scale of a gift. Singularity, meaning the giver is always and only benevolent. Priority, meaning a gift is given before there's any initiative on the part of the recipient. Incongruity, meaning a gift is given regardless of the worth of the recipient. Efficacy, meaning a gift empowers the one to whom it is given. Non-circularity, meaning there is no expected return for a gift. Barclay shows that the 6th characteristic was not part of the ancient conception of gift, only of some current understandings. With what I've very briefly summarized, I want to suggest that the language of grace and gift is ideal scriptural language that frames our relationship to the land. Sanders corrected our understanding of the Old Testament and covenant. It was not a list of demands to be followed in order to earn favor. The covenant, rather, was a grace-based relationship. A gift of grace was granted, the redemption from slavery from Egypt, and resulted in a mutually agreed-upon reciprocal relationship between both parties, the Mosaic covenant. And Barclay has helped us to understand the new covenant in this way as well. Jesus has given us a superior gift of grace, which results in mutually agreed-upon reciprocal relationship with his people. In both of these cases, the superior nature of that initiating gift is superabundant. The reciprocity for the gift will begin and continue indefinitely in this grace-framed relationship. This shows us that the gifts of Creator are always grace-framed. They always entail continued reciprocity. The very first verse of the Bible makes it clear that the Creator is the source of all things. The days of creation unfold by God creating the habitation, the sky, the water, the land, and then filling the habitation with inhabitants, the celestial bodies, aquatic creatures, land creatures, sky creatures. Through the 6 days, there's a pattern of God issuing forth a command for something to be created, and then followed by God acting upon his own command by creating, naming, or placing the created thing into its functional position. The work is theocentric, with God issuing and then God completing the command, either implicitly or explicitly. Here's a table, and if you need to see it more clearly, it's on in the paper. One more click. There we go. So he gives a command, God gives the command, and then God is the one who responds to the command. We see here a pattern. The gift of being created by God, as well as a sphere in which the created thing occupies. This gift establishes a reciprocity, with the celestial bodies performing their proper function, and marine and sky creatures being fertile will fulfill God's command. The Creator initiates the relationship with a grace gift, and then establishes the means of reciprocity. Given this pattern, it is important not to miss one extremely telling break from the established pattern. It's that blank row above that I'm about to fill once I click. On day 3, as expected, God issues forth a command beginning in verse 11. God said, "Let the earth grow plant life, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit with seeds inside it, each according to its own kind throughout the earth." And that's what happened. The earth produced plant life, plants yielding seeds, each according to its kind, and trees bearing fruit with seeds inside it, each according to its kind. God saw how good it was. Whereas in all other instances, God gives the command, and then God explicitly or implicitly is the one who fulfills the command. In this verse, it is the earth that obeys the command. The land here is described as co-creator of vegetation. The co-creation of vegetation is very important to recognize, as this vegetation from the 3rd day is spoken of again on the 6th day. God gives this co-created vegetation as food for all life. This act of giving clearly fits that profile of grace gift from John Barclay's taxonomy and initiates a continued grace-framed reciprocal relationship between the receivers and the co-creators, the creator and the land. This triangulation of a grace-framed reciprocal relationship is established in our 7-day creation narrative in the Scripture. I want to now move to show how this triangulated relationship is present elsewhere. The relationship represented is triangular, i.e., it affects and connects all 3 points together in a relational circle. But the nature of the triangulation also shows that the sides of the triangle, as it were, indicate a continual relationship between 2 points uniquely as well. In other words, there is evidence of good and bad relations at times between 2 different points of the triangle in the Scriptures. So for the first side, God and the non-human creation, together the community of creation, we see on this side a relationship of reciprocity. It's often jarring for modern Christians in the Western tradition to think of God as having a relationship with creation. Modern Western Christianity is theistic when discussing God and humanity, but deistic when talking about God and non-human creation. But the land obeys the command of Creator in Genesis 1. We also see that aquatic life and bird life are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. In Genesis 1:22, the language is clearly reciprocal. God commands that they do something, be fruitful and multiply, and this is their response to his grace gift. The reciprocal relationship continues between God and creation and is present in other passages of Scripture as well. The most theologically dense expression of this continued relationship is Psalm 104. This psalm describes a portrayal of God's continuing creativity and lavish care of the earth that he's made. Verses 14 to 23 of that psalm describes God's gift as superabundance. The bounty of God, the outpouring of his goodness and plenty go beyond what is essential to maintain life. And the psalm will go on to talk about mountains, trees, and animals. He has interest in trees and mountains and rock cairns that simply serve non-human purposes. Here's a description of the grace gift from the psalm. All your creations wait for you to give them their food on time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled completely full. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to dust. When you let loose your breath, they are created, and you make the surface of the ground brand new again. Psalm 104, 27 to 30. Well, my favorite example from the scriptures of the ongoing relationship between creator and non-human creation is God's response to Job's complaints at the end of Job. Serving as the climax, I'm quoting here, serving as the climax of the book, God's answer to Job aims to reconstruct Job's view of creation. God presents, one could say, the full self-revelation of creation, and it is a wonder to behold. God reveals the marvels of the cosmic world, the unfathomable depth and bewildering diversity of creation. God takes Job on a cosmic tour, transporting him to worlds far beyond his ken, the earth's foundations, the singing stars, the swaddled sea, the gates of the deep dark, the storehouses of hail, the dwelling place of light, flowing channels in the desert, all beyond human control and experience. The first animal, the lion, as with nearly every creature, is introduced with a challenge cast as a question. Yahweh challenges Job to imagine himself providing for the lion. In Yahweh's answer, Job is privileged to behold creation at its most wondrous and terrifying, while discovering that he is not centrally or hierarchically related to any of it. In short, God's long response to Job makes it clear that he continues to have a relationship with non-human creation, which humanity has no part in. These words, direct from the mouth of God, profoundly limit what it means to be God's image bearer who is called to rule and subdue creation. And I'll talk more about this below. The scriptures also indicate God's displeasure at times with aspects of non-human creation, and God delivers consequences upon non-human creation. This indicates a continued relationship, not simply a relationship of a dispassionate, deistic creator. The first example is in Eden. When the non-human creation, the snake, is punished for improper action. Another prime example is the covenant God creates with all of creation in Genesis 9:5 after the flood. Not only is the covenant with all the living creatures, not just humans, but God also makes it clear that animals are held accountable for impermissible shedding of blood. God's reciprocal relationship with non-human creation is ongoing, and he has expectations of it too. Exodus 21:28 continues to hold up this law from Genesis 9, with the rule that an ox that kills a person being put to death for their action. Another striking example of non-human creation being held accountable is Ezekiel 6, where God condemns both the people and the mountains for allowing the pollution of idolatry. Ezekiel views the people and the land as intimately connected, and in Ezekiel's thought, both the land and the people must face punishment for their actions of idolatry. Yet in this condemnation, God is said to be crushed in Ezekiel 6:9, a highly emotive term that indicates brokenness of spirit. Side 2, humanity and non-human creation. In the setting of the garden, we see this part of the triangle clearly expressed as a reciprocal relationship. I've already discussed the co-creation of vegetation by God and the land. God, and implicitly the land, then gives this gift of food to humans and animals. This is a grace gift. It will establish an ongoing reciprocity that Creator will specify. In the garden, the Creator now establishes how humanity will give back to the land in reciprocity. I'm not personally satisfied with any modern translations of Genesis 2:15, so I'm going to try and give you the superior translation, the ZAV. The best current English translation, I think, is probably the NET, the New English Translation, which says, "The Lord God took the man and placed him in the orchard in Eden to care for it and to maintain it." The first verb is avad, and is translated to care for. This word occurs 287 times in the Hebrew Bible, overwhelmingly translated as to serve. But usually modern translations choose to till it or to work it. These translation choices betray an objectified and utilitarian view of the land. But I've already shown that the land co-creates that which now sustains us as humans. In a grace-framed relationship, the only proper response is reciprocity. And as with all of God's gifts, our reciprocity, no matter how sincere, can only ever be a token gesture. It's the land that takes care of us. To serve is thus an ideal translation for the Hebrew word avad when talking about our reciprocal response to Mother Earth. The second Hebrew word is shamar. Most translations, again, do a disservice by choosing an innocuous word, to keep. Keep in modern English no longer conveys the sense of preservation and protection inherent in the word. Preserve it and protect it are better options. However, this word is used specifically in the context of covenant discussions in the law. that I think suggests a more nuanced meaning of the word. Some examples: Genesis 17:9, God tells Abraham, "You must keep my covenant." Throughout Exodus and the law, the Israelites are told to keep the feasts, to keep customs, to keep commands and statutes, to keep the Sabbath. In these examples, almost always in a covenantal context, to keep these things is to conform one's action and practice. In the Mosaic Law, the call is not just to know the law, but to conform their lives to it. I think that in view of the co-creation language from Genesis 1:9-12 and the concept of the grace-framed relationship, we can say with a measure of confidence that an accurate and more potent translation of Genesis 2:15 is, Yahweh God took the human and settled him in the Garden of Eden to serve it and to conform to it. This is relational language, it's covenantal language, it's reciprocal language. Confirmation of this choice comes in the very next verses, where God commands the human, "Eat your fill from all of the garden's trees, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat from it, you will die." This is a command by God to be obeyed, and simultaneously calls the human to conform to the garden. God makes explicit the grace gift of supplied food provided by God and land, but one tree serves another purpose. The first command to the human in the garden is a call to conform to the land the human now abides in. At several points, the scripture states that God punishes humanity directly in defense of the land. In Leviticus 18, God says through Moses, I quote, "Don't make for yourselves unclean in any of these ways, because that's how the nations that I'm throwing out before you became unclean. This is also how the land became unclean, and I held it liable for punishment, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But all of you must keep my rules and my regulations. You must not do any of these detestable things, neither citizen nor immigrant who lives with you, because the people who had the land before you did all of these detestable things, and the land became unclean. So that the land does not vomit you out because you have made it unclean." This is a remarkable passage that confirms the triangular relationship. Like Ezekiel 6, the land tied to humanity bears some punishment that the humans face because we are tied to them. But the passage next goes on to show that the land itself is acting in retaliation with the very descriptive act of being vomited out. In this passage, God declares that the Canaanites sinned against the land, and the Israelite conquest was both God and the land's ejection of those people. But this punishment by the land and God's defense of the land is not just against Israel's enemies. 2 Chronicles, near its close, summarizes the Babylonian exile this way. The Babylonians burned God's temple down, demolished the walls of Jerusalem, set fire to all its palaces, destroying everything of value. Finally, he exiled to Babylon anyone who survived the killing so that they could be his slaves and the slaves of his children until Persia came to power. This is how the Lord's word spoken by Jeremiah was carried out. And here's the main line. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest. For as long as it lay empty, it rested until 70 years were completed. This passage shows us that a lack of reciprocity toward the land by the Israelites meant that God steps in and prioritizes the need of the land. The Sabbath rest spoken of here points to one of the most important components of the Mosaic Law when discussing the relationship with the land. Frequently, in the Mosaic Law, Yahweh reminds the Israelites that the land belongs to him and it's given as a gift. Exodus 6:8, Leviticus 25:23. This reminder is especially made through the Sabbath regulations. The Israelites are told to honor a sabbatical year in which debts were forgiven, indentured slaves were released, and the land was left to grow fallow. The language in Leviticus 25 is very clearly relational language, reflecting this triangulation of a grace-framed relationship. This is Leviticus 25. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and you shall gather its field. But in the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land, a Sabbath of rest for Yahweh. You must not sow your field, and you must not prune your vineyard. You must not reap your harvest's aftergrowth, and you must not harvest the grapes of your unpruned vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. This section goes on to talk about everyone and anyone, human and animal alike, being allowed to eat whatever the land chooses to provide during that year, but it cannot be tilled or harvested. The land, as is so often the case, is the median place for the blessings we receive by the Creator. The passage thus indicates that there is rest for all parties within the triangulation, the Israelites, the land, and even God. The final side of the triangle for this grace-framed relationship is the connection between God and humanity. There are several important points for our discussion on land that I want to highlight. The land is given as a gift to all its inhabitants, of whom we are just one. But it's also important to recognize that God's design was for humanity to be a gift to creation as well. Genesis 1 declares that humanity is made in the image of God. The flaw in much thinking about being in the image is that it is just about unique human abilities or characteristics like intelligence or self-awareness. But to be an imager, or to be a representative for God on earth, has to do with our call as human beings to represent the Creator. God next describes what our ongoing reciprocal response to the grace-framed gift should be in the creation, in what we call the creation mandate or the cultural mandate. Quote, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of heaven and over every animal that moves upon the earth." Genesis 1:28. Within the triangulation of this grace-framed relationship, the vocation of human beings to be God's imagers would be to imitate the creativity of God, witnessed in the days of creation, and to actively aid creation in reciprocating its relationship to the Creator as well. Understanding this helps to properly understand what it means for us to subdue the earth. This seems abundantly clear in the next sentence because he says, "Take charge of the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and everything crawling on the ground." Recall that the Creator has already given a mandate to the fish and the birds. The mandate to God's imagers to take charge over wildlife is expressly to help them flourish and thereby live out Creator's command for reciprocity. To do our job, we listen and learn from the Creator, and we listen and learn from the land and the animals themselves, as they are the ones who received the command in the first place. This charge to subdue the earth is also immediately curtailed by God, announcing that the plants that were co-created by God and the land in chapter 1, 9-12, are now given to everything that lives as food. This firmly restricts the creation mandate to subdue and rule, as God makes it clear that food is not theirs for the taking in subjugation. It is a gift. It is at this point when the interdependence between humanity and the land is most clearly stated, and it is only at this point that God saw that it was very good. On this final day of creation, God establishes inter-reliance. The declaration of being very good is not just that he's completed his work of creating, but also that now the community of creation exists in interdependence. This is what is very good. As we've seen on the other sides of our triangulation, there's a response by a third party in the group when a lack of reciprocity in the grace-framed relationship is shown between 2 points. The most obvious example of this is the result of the rebellion in the garden. Our first parents disregard God's one rule. The result is removal from the beauty of the garden, which removes access from the tree of life. This means that the reciprocal relationship with the land has now grown more difficult. What was to be graceful reciprocity will now at times be begrudging reciprocity. Because of this triangulation, our relational tie to the earth means that our sins affect the entire web of our relationships in the community of creation. And the land will punish us for our rebellion now too, as weeds and thistles will grow for you, even as you eat the field's plants. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread. I won't do that yet. A final component on this side of the triangulation of relationship I want to discuss is how the relationship between Yahweh and his chosen people conforms to the land they occupy. This shows once again how the relational triangle portrays itself, and it goes to supporting my suggestion that God commanded our first parents in the garden to serve the land and conform to it. Much of Israel's religious life is focused around feasts and festivals. Here's a table which breaks down the religious festivals of the Jewish calendar. Here's the cycle of feasts and festivals, as well as the cycle of the rains and the harvests. Let me read a little bit about it to you. Mosaic law instructs that the Israelites are to make a pilgrimage to the temple for 3 separate festivals: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. The first 2 religious festivals frame the barley and wheat harvests in April, May, while the third festival follows the olive harvest in October. Passover blended directly into the 7-day celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which celebrated the Exodus from Egypt. 7 weeks or 50 days later, at the conclusion of the grain harvest, the Israelites celebrated the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. This festival helped the people to be mindful to celebrate the first fruits of what they had sowed in the fields. The final pilgrimage festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, took place at the conclusion of the agricultural harvest when the farmers finished gathering in the last of the summer fruit. Such provisions were associated with the people's present reality of the annual agricultural yield made possible by God's provision of the early and later rains. By combining the agricultural cycle and the religious calendar, the land's annual cycle pulls its observers through a memory of who they are and what their identity is as God's people. So the Jewish calendar, which regulated their religious life and was specifically mandated by Yahweh in the Mosaic Law, was based on the repetitive cycle of the land which they occupied. Their religious life conformed to the land they were in. This triangulation of relationship is not new to me. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann suggested this same type of triangulation in his book called The Land, Place as Gift, Promise, and Challenge in Biblical Faith. In this book, Brueggemann discusses the fact that at the center of the triangle for Israel stood the law, and later was mediated by the king, for better or worse. So too has Christopher Wright suggested this triangulation of relationship in his book, The Mission of God. Wright shares the following diagram, which I've modified a little bit. When Wright talks about this triangulation, he's talking about Acts 17, Paul's encounter with the philosophers in Athens. What Paul says in Acts 17 assumes the triangulation of this grace-framed relationship between the Creator, humanity, and the land, even when he's talking to non-Jews. Now, throughout my paper, I've jumped back and forth between these two triangles, showing how that large triangulation starts in our creation story and relates to all of humanity, and then jumping to the law and the prophets to show how it worked in that smaller triangle between the Creator, Israel, and the land that they were in. The triangulation of that grace-framed reciprocal relationship is established at creation for all of us. And Israel shows us just one example of how that triangulation of relationship ought to have been lived out. But we're not Israelites, nor do we occupy land in the Mediterranean. The rhythms of their religious life in the feasts and festivals conformed to the cycles of that land, not ours. These would not fit peoples that occupy different lands that have different rhythms. Israel's triangulation provides us a model in the general, not in the specifics. Where does this leave us as ones grafted into the family of God as followers of Jesus and members of a new covenant? The first thing to recognize is that Jesus, as a Jewish man indigenous to his homeland, lived within this triangulation already. He assumed its teachings from the Old Testament for his people. Jesus and the New Testament authors also assumed that this triangulation existed for other nations living in their own lands. Again, I think our modern English translations do us a disservice at times. The word so often translated as Gentiles, even in the modern day translations, really should just be translated as nations. Jews understood nations to be distinct groups of people in their own triangulation of relationship. They were not seen as a generic clump, yet the translation Gentiles implies this. And what does this mean as we speak about the good news, and as we understand in part what it means to be followers of Jesus in the land that we are supposed to be in relationship with? But also those called to go out to other nations, obeying the Great Commission given by the resurrected Jesus in Matthew 28. In the context of what I've presented today, part of the gospel proclamation is to recognize, correct, and live into this grace-framed reciprocal relationship. It is contextual to people and the land they occupy. But there's a guiding force, an anchor that unites all of these triangulations across people, nations, and different lands. And it's a right relationship with the Creator. I mentioned earlier when discussing Walter Brueggemann that in the center of the triangle sat the law, mediated by the king. A balanced triangulation is now mediated and guided by the best possible example, the Creator made flesh. The relational issue with many nations during the time of the Israelites and during the time of Jesus was who occupied the place of deity. This is what rightly orders our relationships. If the place of deity in Jesus' day was Caesar, the triangulation was out of balance and resulted in relational brokenness throughout. If it was the ancient Phoenician god Molech who required child sacrifice, presumed class distinctions and slavery, the triangulation would bring harm and disunity. The gospel announces in the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Creator's own work to make right the balance. The Creator offers himself to be at the center, to mediate these relationships. He points the way, to place the Creator rightly understood and followed at the top of the triangulation of the relationship. Who sits in the place of the deity will order the interrelationships. And if there's disharmony, it is in part because the wrong entity occupies the place of deity at the top of the triangle. And amongst the many things that Jesus can bring right order to, it is our relationship with the land and place we occupy to respond to GraceLand with grace-filled reciprocity. Thank you.